Hello, learners, and welcome to Chapter 9, which is all about muscle physiology. And we're going to be able to learn about how we generate movement in the body. So first, we'll start off with structure and organization of muscle tissue. Then we'll figure out how muscles actually shorten for contraction through the sliding filament theory. Next, we'll talk about muscle contraction, which basically means how are muscles triggered and then controlled in order to contract. Next, then we'll be talking about motor units and really the nervous system and how they have a role in fine-tuning the force of muscles. We'll then get into ATP regeneration because muscles generate ATP as their energy source. And then we'll get into muscle fiber types because guess what? Different muscle fiber types and how they actually can influence the endurance or strength of a muscle. And finally, we'll talk about exercise effects. Literally, this just means how exercise reshapes muscles' performance and helps reshape the structure of a muscle. So let's go ahead and get to it. Let's talk about the overall properties of muscle tissue. So muscle tissue is specialized for contraction, and the goal is to create movement. And what does that actually mean? That means at the tissue level, muscles are the only tissue that can move. We're not talking about the cellular level because there's going to be more things that can move at the cellular level. But if we're talking about the tissue level, again, muscles are the only tissue that can move. And muscles move in one way. It shortens or contracts with force. Another thing you're going to understand is that muscles only pull. They do not push. They only pull. So those details are going to help us kind of get in our mind how muscle tissue starts to work. Okay? Now, what do they actually do? Well, they're going to take the chemical energy stored in ATP and convert it to mechanical energy for movement. And when that happens, you do generate heat, which is why a lot of times you might see people say, oh, well, the movement of your muscles helps with homeostasis because it helps maintain your body temperature. All muscles share specific properties, and these are the four properties we're going to focus on: contractility, extensibility, elasticity, and excitability. So what is contractility? Contractility means that you are forcibly shortening the actual muscle. We'll put shorten. Extensibility means you have the ability to stretch the muscle. Elasticity means that muscle has its ability to return to its original size. So after all that shortening from contraction and that stretching, then you need to want to be able to have that muscle be able to get back to its original size. That's what elasticity is for. And then one of the most important is going to be that muscle tissue has the ability to, of the property of excitability. And that means it can transmit stimuli. So let's focus on excitability first. Now, in this graphic here, you see that the nervous system, that's what this brain and spinal cord is looking at, is going to be passing a signal to the muscular system. And that's true. That can happen. It can transmit that stimuli, all right, through axon terminals, which is really important. But also, muscle cells then need to be able to pass that signal that they just got from that axon terminal to the rest of the muscle tissue, the muscle fibers, right, which you get into as we go along. And so muscle tissues can do that as well, which is really cool. Now let's talk about contractility, because we can't actually have a muscle contract without it being excited, okay? So contractility, again, you are forcibly shortening the muscle. As you can see here, we have an arm, and we have our biceps brachii here and our triceps brachii at the bottom. Or again, you say your biceps and your triceps. And as you can see, when your arm is straightened, it's going to be the triceps brachii that gets a little bit shorter here. When your forearm is bent at the elbow, you see your biceps brachii, that gets shortened. And so with that force of shortening, that's where we get that contraction from. Muscles also have the ability to stretch. So you see a person here in a yoga pose. And this just means that if you pull on a muscle, it's able to get longer. So if it can contract and shorten, and of course stretch with extensibility, and get pulled on to get longer, we want to make sure that it can have that elasticity, like I said, so it can return back to its normal or original size. That means muscle tissue is very unique with all these different properties, okay? And excitability is just so cool because when you think about it, you're like, okay, the membranes of muscle cells are excitable much like the nervous system. And this is going to be extremely important because the muscle cells need to know when they're supposed to contract, right? They can't just go all willy-nilly contracting. You don't want to be walking and all of a sudden your legs start contracting, right? You want to make sure that it's actually some kind of controlled sequence. And that means that we have to know how that contraction happened. And that's where the excitability and contraction connection come in. Now let's go back and actually start talking about more different types of muscle tissue. And of course, that means we're going to be talking about skeletal muscle tissue, cardiac muscle tissue, and smooth muscle. So there are 3 types of muscle tissue in the body, like I just said: skeletal muscle, cardiac muscle, and smooth muscle. Our focus, of course, is going to be skeletal muscle, and that's the one we're going to be going through. Now, when we talk about cardiac muscle, you'll see it a little bit when it comes to the cardiovascular system, and cardiophysiology. And smooth muscle, we'll see a little bit of understanding when we get to the digestive system. But when folks say muscle tissue, we need to be able to make sure they can distinguish what they're talking about. So what we're doing here is taking all the different types of muscle tissue and using location, whether they're voluntary, meaning you can consciously think of it to move that muscle, or it's involuntary, meaning you don't have to think about it to move that muscle. Whether or not the actual tissue itself is striated, so it has these little crosswise stretches on it, or really pattern, okay? And then also how many nuclei are within the cells of these different muscles. That's what we get to kind of focus on. Now, I will put light microscope here, because these images that we see here are from a light microscope. That means if you were to get one of these images, say on an exam, for example, you should be able to say, oh, I can distinguish whether it's skeletal muscle, cardiac muscle, or smooth muscle. All right, when it comes to location, skeletal muscle is connected to bones. Now, how do skeletal muscles connect to bones? That's going to be through tendons, okay? Cardiac muscle is, of course, going to be located in the heart. Smooth muscle is going to be located in the blood vessels, because that's how our blood is able to be squeezed and moved through our entire body, and also hollow organs. So we can think like our bladder, our digestive tract, for example. And whether or not these muscles are voluntary or involuntary is going to be very important. So skeletal muscle is voluntary. I have to consciously say, hey, I'm going to move my wrist. You may be thinking you're just moving your wrist whenever you want, but no, your whole body works together, right? So you're not just moving your wrist anytime you want. You actually are thinking about moving your wrist, and then it's happening, right? So that skeletal muscle is always going to be voluntary. But when it comes to cardiac muscle and smooth muscle, they're both involuntary. Now the question becomes, why are they involuntary? Well, think about it. Do you want to be telling your heart to beat at every moment? No, because what if you forget one day? You're done, right? So we don't want that to happen. We need that to be involuntary and autonomic. What about smooth muscle? Do you want to tell your digestive tract when to actually break down food into their macronutrients, so then those can be broken down? Do you want to tell your digestive tract when to actually absorb micronutrients? Do you want to tell your blood vessels when to move blood throughout your body? No, right? So that's the reason why these are both involuntary. Next, we can talk about the appearance, which means we do have to look at our light microscopes pictures here. So striation, that just means, do the actual muscle tissue have a pattern, okay? And a striation means that you kind of have this crosswise pattern, or you can say like little stripes going on it. And sometimes there's going to be 2 tissues that are going to be striated. They have these like cross patterns, and then of course one that does not. But one that is not, that's non-striated, is going to be smooth muscle. So when you look at the smooth muscle here, yes, I see some nuclei, I see my smooth muscle. I don't see any weird crosswise patterns, okay? So there's no like little crosswise patterns in any kind of random directions or anything like that. That's why it's non-striated. But when I look at my skeletal muscle and cardiac muscle, I do see some kind of pattern. It looks like it's like little lines going like this, right? Let me go ahead and draw a couple more little lines. So yes, skeletal muscle is definitely striated. Now, with skeletal muscle, it's very easy to see those striations. Remember, I'm just saying, I can see all these little lines here. Yes. You can also see more patterns here. Just a bunch of little straight lines that makes it easier to be able to see. And then I see a bunch of nuclei as well. So it's really easy to distinguish that skeletal muscle, because it just looks perfectly striated with all these nuclei. But with cardiac muscle, the striations are a little bit harder to see. So what you want to do to distinguish the two is you want to look for branching. You see that with the skeletal muscle, it all looks kind of parallel in this way. With cardiac muscle, you start seeing these branches. So I see some branching off here. I see some branching off here, and I'm just calling out a couple of them. Okay, I see a little bit branching here. Boom, more branching, all looking branched off. And so because of the branching, it could be very hard to find the striations. Like, for example, I see some striations here. Let me get it better. I see some striations around this area. A little bit of striations there, and I see a little bit here, and that's about it. Everything else is like, where are the striations at? They're there, but they also are harder to see, especially since we're at the light microscope visuals here. So what you want to do is be able to look for branching. So how would I distinguish? Skeletal muscle, quintessential, striated, has a bunch of nuclei. Cardiac muscle are branched, Yes, you can see some striations if you look really closely, but most of the time you see that they're branched. And smooth muscle has no striations at all, and it just looks like all in one direction and smooth. Okay, that's what the smoothness comes from. Now let's talk about the number of nuclei per cell. Number of nuclei per cell is going to be very important. Why? Because when you think of a muscle, you want to make sure that you have an energy source. You also want to make sure you have a protein source, right? And what do nuclei do? They're helping to build proteins, which can then be, and also they're using DNA and everything inside of nuclei are made up of nucleotides, which of course ATP is adenosine, which is a nucleotide. So you want to be able to have all these pieces ready and willing to go. Now, skeletal muscle is really cool because skeletal muscles can be long fibers, they can be short fibers. It just depends. Their actual cells are the length of however long that muscle is. So if you're talking about your rectus femoris, which is in front of your quads, yes, the length of that entire muscle from one end to the other, one entire skeletal muscle cell, or it's called muscle fiber, is that entire length, which is pretty cool. So if we have these long lengths of muscle fibers, then we need to make sure there's a lot of nuclei so we get all the resources we need for these longer cells. So for skeletal muscles, there's very many nuclei. Okay. Now let's talk about cardiac muscle. A lot of times they say, oh, there's only one nucleus per cell of cardiac muscle, but we also can have 1 to 2, so it just depends. Okay. Now here it's going to be harder to see, but you can have one single cell, okay, that's one nucleus there. And then you see a nucleus here, and you might be like, there's nucleus right there, but that also can be endothelium tissue, so just keep that in mind. And for some of them, like, do I see anything that has like double nuclei? Maybe that little piece looks like a double nuclei, but still not 100% clear. We definitely see one that just has one. And I think that's because they want to verify that. But remember, it could have 1 to 2, but it's not going to be like many, like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, like we see for this, right? And then for smooth muscle, it's also going to have one nuclei. So when you're seeing all these nuclei here, that means we have smooth muscle cell. They're all individual cells with one nucleus. Similar to with cardiac muscle, you'll see like one nuclei is going to be a cardiac muscle cell, right? And then when you have some tiny nuclei kind of in between the branching, again, that's usually endothelium. All right, folks, let's go ahead and get into a single worksheet example based on what we've learned thus far. I'm going to focus on number 3. What type of muscle tissue is shown in the slide to the right? So here we go. It's saying, is it cardiac, skeletal, smooth, or just too impossible to tell? Now, remember, we just went over 3 muscle tissue types. And what do I notice here? I see a pattern. I see striations going across, crosswise pattern. Also see many nuclei, at least more than one. And so automatically smooth muscle is out because we do see that pattern, which means it's not striated. It is striated. So that's saying, okay, is it impossible to tell for the image? Well, no, that's out too, because if we know it's striated, then we're down to 2 choices. Cardiac muscle or for skeletal muscle tissue. How do we distinguish between the two? Cardiac branches. Okay, so there's no branching here that I see. I see a basic pattern. There you go. It is letter B. All right, folks, I'll see you in the next video where we get to talk about the structure of skeletal tissue. See you then.